Hey there! And I was supposed to be out of this house almost a month ago. But I'm still here. Not legally, but I'm still here. They've shut off the water, heat, and the power. Everything you see in front of you is entirely running on AA batteries. But you're also probably wondering, hey, why are you sitting on the floor? Well, it's to keep him out. Open this door! Yeah. But it's Christmas time, which means presents, yeah. When it comes to video games, a lot of people probably want stuff like a Nintendo Switch, a PlayStation 5, maybe even the new Xbox if you're an idiot. But back in Christmas of 1994, kids were wanting something that wasn't a PS5 or an Xbox, and I can tell you for certain, it wasn't a Sega Saturn. The Sony Playstation, a worldwide phenomenon created entirely from spite. This thing has dominated almost every generation it's been a part of, except for the time Nintendo built a rod, but we'll talk about that one later. The Sony Playstation is a disc-based console released in December of 1994. It came out a few weeks after the Sega Saturn, and about a year and a half before the Nintendo 64. It sold 102 million units, but the PS1 wasn't always going to be its own console. A long time ago, Nintendo and Sony had a partnership not too different from the one Nintendo had with Atari, except it wasn't revolved around an entire console, just a CD add-on. Yep, that's right, the PlayStation 1 was originally going to be a CD add-on. It was for the Super Nintendo and was kind of its own console, except that it would just leech things off of the SNES like the power and the controllers. Making the console a CD add-on never really made much sense to me, mainly because A, the Satellaview was a thing, and B, Nintendo made fun of Sega for having things like the 32X and the Sega CD during their competition. The PS1's original prototype made much more sense as it was just an SNES and a CD peripheral packed into one box. Eventually Nintendo broke off their deal with Sony after finding out that they would be basically making no money from the deal. Nintendo would go on to create the Nintendo 64, and Sony would go on to birth basically a runaway success. Like I said, the PS1 was a runaway success, and in fact, its successor, the PS2, would end up becoming the best-selling console ever. I mean, this thing has yet to be outsold. When it comes to the PS1, I actually quite like the system, except for this little port right here, which is the memory card port. Now, I have only briefly mentioned my disliking towards memory cards in the past, but with the PS1, memory cards were kind of necessary. The console is incredibly small. The Sega Saturn had some built-in storage and an optional memory cartridge, but the Sega Saturn was also much larger than the PS1, and it could get away with some built-in storage. And then there's the Nintendo 64. It was a cartridge-based system. All the memory was stored on the cartridges. Most of the time. Now, being a fairly small disc-based console, memory cards were pretty much required, but it still doesn't mean I like them. But moving away from memory cards for a little bit, let's talk about probably the second most important thing when it comes to a console: the sex appeal. The controller. The original PlayStation controller is an alright controller. It's actually not too different from the SNES controller. The PS1 controller just adds thighs and 2 extra shoulder buttons. But these shoulder buttons do lead me to my first complaint about the controller.
the back of the buttons are too small. I mean, look how much space is just left there. And don't even get me started on the quality of the plastic used. I mean, I feel like I could break this thing over my knee.
Oh!
Now, in 1996, the Nintendo 64 launched with probably the most revolutionary controller ever. Now, the Nintendo 64 controller hasn't aged the greatest, but it was the first controller to have a joystick that is so commonly seen on controllers today. Sega and Sony were pretty quick to respond with joysticks of their own, but out of the two, Sony definitely had the better controller. Which leads us into introducing the DualShock! And I can say for a fact that this controller fixes a lot of my problems with the controller that came before it. And it adds not one, but two joysticks. As much as I like the DualShock, the two new joysticks leads to a new problem. The joysticks are almost completely useless on this console. There's only one game out of the entire PS1 library that actually requires the use of the DualShock, and the rest have little to either no support for the stupid thing.
Now, even though the original PlayStation has almost no support for the DualShock whatsoever, it is a significantly better controller, and if you do plan on playing PS1 games, I would go with this controller over this one. This one just sucks. But a controller is fairly useless unless you have some games to play. Now, obviously, I have no shortage of games to talk about in my hand right here. In fact, this isn't even all of them. But for time's sake, and because a lot of these games I do want to go in more depth in on the future, I'm going to keep the reviews fairly short. So let's talk about the first game in the pile, Mars Moose Cosmic Quest 1 City Sights. It's an educational game.
Mars Moose was developed and published by Lightspan Adventures. Lightspan specialized in making educational games that were only available to schools. Some schools would just rent the games out like library books, and some would just keep the games in classrooms to use as educational tools. The single game that I have is pretty generic. You just fly around a single street helping businesses and collecting dog treats so you can get your stupid space dog to stop chasing this weird cat squirrel thing. Honestly, I don't think the moose is the alien here. But while we're still on the topic of abominations to nature, Crash Bandicoot! Okay, in all honestness, I actually really like the Crash Bandicoot games. Now, the only one of the original trilogy I own is the first game, and while I like this game, it suffers a lot from that first game clunk, but not nearly as bad as something like Sonic. Crash's gameplay is very simple. It's just a simple 3D platformer where you run down tight corridors. In fact, you could almost consider this a 2D platformer. Your end goal in this game is to beat the evil Neo Cortex and save Crash's girlfriend Tana. And it's still on the topic of Crash Bandicoot, Crash Team Racing is the next game I own. This game is definitely my favorite PS1 game, hands down. CTR is basically a Mario Kart clone, but it's a clone that's done right. And I would make the argument that this game is better than Mario Kart 64. CTR, along with having all of your basic racing modes, also has an adventure mode. Your goal in this is to collect all the trophies in order to race against Nitrous Oxide, an alien who wants to turn Earth into a parking lot.
Now, the rest of my PS1 games are either whatever or
I doubt I will live long enough to see a good M&ms game. This game in particular, Emami Shellshock, is really bad. In fact, it's basically just a really bad Crash Bandicoot clone that looks like someone had a one-night stand with a box of Crayola markers. And it plays just as bad as well. I mean, just... oh my.
Okay, well, moving on, next we got... Oh, come on!
Barbie gotta have games. It's a minigame collection, and a pretty mediocre one at that. It's pink, with some more pink slapped together with some PNGs. It's not good. I mean, this game came out in 2003. The PS2, GameCube, and original Xbox had all come out at that time. This game launched 3 days before Mario Party 5.
Yeah, I bet that really hurt Nintendo's sales. But Barbie Gotta Have Games and M&ms Shellshock is a prime example of shovelware. Shovelware is basically you take a super popular console and you dump garbage on it just to try to make a quick buck. But what do you get when you have a game that isn't considered shovelware, and in fact, it's considered one of the best on the console, but you don't think it's very good? You get death threats.
Alright, I'm just gonna say it. I don't think the original Tomb Raider games are that good. I'm sure they got better later, but considering that I have only played through the first game and a demo of the second game, I think I can safely say that they aren't that great. The games look great and the concept is super interesting, but the controls just have aged like milk. The first Tomb Raider game came out only a few months after Super Mario 64, and at that time there was really no way of knowing that that game was going to revolutionize the way the 3D game should look and play. Now, the original Tomb Raider will get a bit of a pass for not being that good of a first game, mainly because the first game clunk, and what they were trying to do was pretty experimental. But the game's sequel, I don't think should get a pass. Conveniently, my copy of Tomb Raider has a few demos for other games packed into it, and one of them is a demo for Tomb Raider 2. The graphics look better, as they should, but the game has the same stupid controls. A year after Tomb Raider 2 came out, Ocarina of Time came out, and that game was basically the same thing, but better, and I don't even like Ocarina of Time that much.
My biggest problem with Tomb Raider is just the controls. They aren't very good. They're like the Nintendo 64 controller. They haven't aged too well. But enough of Tomb Raider. Let's talk about the last game that I have to talk about. Gran Turismo 2.
Gran Turismo 2 was actually the first PS1 game I ever played. I played this game before Mars Moose, which was in the PlayStation when I got it. Gran Turismo is a fine racing game. It looks good, sounds good, and the controls are fine. But the second I got Crash Team Racing, this game pretty much ceased to exist for me. I'm not a huge fan of these realistic arcade-style racing games. If it wasn't obvious enough, I much prefer goofy mascot racers. Gran Turismo isn't a bad game, but I would just rather play something else, like Crash Team Racing.
And that was the Sony Playstation, and most of the games I owned for this console. There was a lot of things I could have talked about, like Resident Evil or Final Fantasy VII, but I don't own those games. So why would I bother talking about them? I mean, I guess I could have talked about this steering wheel controller I got. It was endorsed by Dale Earnhardt Jr. Finally! I've been trying to get this door open all week! Ah!